Hello, everybody. This is Tiana Park from Spy Palm Partners. Thank you for joining us and welcome. This is a special installment of the Transportation Performance Management, or TPM, webinar series sponsored by the TPM Pooled Fund with support from the AASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Management Leadership and Federal Highways. For more information on the webinar series, just visit tpm-portal.com and click TPM Webinar Series under Events in the main menu. Links to the video and slides from today's webinar, as well as the content from previous webinars, are posted on this site. Today is episode number 3 of a 5-part TPM target setting webinar mini-series that's taking place during the month of July and August. You can register for all upcoming episodes. I'm going to turn my camera off because my internet is saying things are slow. All right. You can register for all upcoming episodes of the Target Setting mini-series at this site. If you have any questions for the presenters during today's webinar, as well as any suggestions for future webinar topics, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature. We'll answer the question during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We're certainly looking forward to all your questions. All right, the TPM Pool Fund, sponsored by AASHTO in cooperation with Federal Highways, is pleased to sponsor the TPM webinar series. The purpose of the webinar series is to support the broad TPM community by sharing lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the transportation performance management community. I think you're really going to enjoy today's presentations. I know I'm looking forward to them. All right, today we're going to focus on state target setting approaches for the federal PM2 measures, so pavements and bridges. Before I jump into the agenda, I'd like to mention that the next 2 webinars in this target setting mini series will focus on the PM3 side, with both one on system performance and one on congestion/emissions performance measurement areas. We have some great speakers lined up and hope you'll join us over the next few weeks for those webinars. For the agenda today, we're going to start with Nelson Hoffman from Federal Highways TPM team, who will provide an overview and federal perspective on target setting for pavements and bridges. Our first agency presentation will be from Chad Allen of the Vermont Agency of Transportation, who will talk about highway infrastructure target setting from the perspective of a small, centralized rural state of Vermont. Following Chad, we'll hear from Tanvir Chowdhury and Adam Mateo of Virginia DOT, who will tag team on VDOT's target setting and performance management for pavements and bridges. Next, we'll hear from Tim Lemon from Michigan DOT, who will focus in on MDOT's pavement target setting. And Mike Johnson from Caltrans will wrap up our agency presentations for this webinar with their approach for setting PM2 targets. Just a reminder, please remember to submit your comments and questions using the Q&A feature on the webinar control panel at any time during today's presentations. And as always, we'll make the slides and video available after today's webinar at tpm-portal.com. You can also download the PDF of the presentations right now in the handouts area of the webinar control panel. Now let's get started and welcome and introduce highway infrastructure target setting by Nelson Hoffman of Federal Highways. Nelson is the FHWA TPM program manager responsible for policy and guidance. Please join me in welcoming Nelson.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Nelson Hoffman from the Federal Highway Administration Transportation Performance Management Team, the TPM team. I'm very glad that you're attending, and I'm looking forward like hopefully you are, in seeing the presentations from the agencies to talk about the infrastructure condition, performance measures, and target setting. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time this morning before we get started talking about the context for target setting for infrastructure condition. And I know that back July the 29th, and that presentation is recorded and available, there was a discussion about target setting for safety performance measures. So my comments this morning are going to be primarily for infrastructure condition, but also for system performance too. So, and what I want to discuss is the relationship and the role between the TPM targets, transportation investments, and long-range plans, including transportation asset management plans and transportation asset in general. So one of the things to sort of strongly keep in mind when you think about the TPM targets is the relationship to long-range plans and what role the TPM targets play. Because the TPM targets, as we all know, is for the 2 and 4 year time frame, and these are the infrastructure condition targets that we're referring to today and during this webinar. And sometimes the comments we hear back and concerns is that time frame of 2 and 4 year targets is too short to really demonstrate results in change based on the transportation investments. And so one thing we need to sort of keep in mind is that these targets are directly related to the 4-year performance period. And as most probably know, we're sort of midway through, a little past midway through the first 4-year performance period. And we're at the mid-performance period. In fact, October the 1st is going to be the mid-performance period progress report that is due. So I want to discuss sort of four items. So the TPM targets should be considered the anticipated and intended condition level. And the 2-year targets represent the midpoint in a performance period, that 4-year performance period. And the 4-year targets represent the anticipated and intended condition level at the end of each of the performance periods. So this means that the target should anticipate the investments or the budget constrained outlook, condition deterioration of unimproved assets, the risk of priority shifts, and other factors. And the established targets should be supported by data and data analysis based on those investments and the existing condition. So the target should be considered as a commitment to certain condition and performance levels resulting from the available resources and the program of projects. So also, secondly, the TPM target should be considered an interim set of targets towards achieving long-term targets and goals that lead to the accomplishment of long-term performance expectations at the state DOTs in their long-range statewide transportation plans and also the NHS transportation asset management plans. So the TPM targets sometimes get seen sort of isolated, but it's important to remember that they are targets as interim look for a long term. So third, another role that these TPM targets and these 2 and 4 year timeframes can provide is that they can really provide a way to understand funding and potential leverage for funding. This is one of the reasons why Federal Highways believes that establishing easy targets and easy targets, targets that are easy to accomplish or aspirational targets, those don't always convey the accurate picture of the planned investment and the investment needs. So lastly, I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about the coming a mid-performance period progress report that is due October the 1st. And we're going to actually take a quick visit to look at some documents and a presentation that we did July the 30th about the performance management form. So the mid-performance period progress report is due October 1st, and it's submitted through the performance management form. Some folks may be familiar with that. That's the PMF. And while the PMF is going to go through some final testing with some volunteer states, it's not open for submittal yet. That's happening September the 1st. However, I'm going to bring up a website. So hopefully you can see this is the FHWA TPM website, and I went to guidance, and what I'm showing here on the screen is this is the performance management form input fields, and this is all of the information that's going to be requested during this mid-performance period progress report. And it's a document that lists all of the questions, all of the information that is going to be pre-populated. And so I think that if folks who are involved in the reporting just wanted to make sure that you knew that this document is open and available for access. Additionally, this was just posted today, the July the 30th webinar that we did about the PMF. The recording is now available for viewing, and it mostly gets into the technical aspects of reporting in the PMF, but there's also some additional information about the PMF and the expectations for the progress reporting. So part of the reason why I wanted to bring this up is the importance of the progress reporting. It's in the mid-performance period progress report. There are questions for the PM2 and PM3 measures that are asking for the states to discuss and provide information about investments that have been made to achieve the 2-year target, and what additional investments are going to be made to achieve the 4-year target, which for this performance period comes in 2022. So with that, I want to wrap up and open for questions as we go through this webinar. Look forward to the presentations, and again, thank you for attending today.
Thanks, Nelson. For our first state DOT presentation this afternoon, we'll hear from Chad Allen of the Vermont Agency of Transportation. Chad has worked for VTrans for over 30 years, and for the last 6 years has served as the Director of the Asset Management Bureau. The Asset Management Bureau is a collaborative team of asset and data professionals working to ensure that the agency is making the right level of investment in the right asset at the right time. One of Chad's professional goals is to strategically manage the agency's business processes to produce a positive increase in the overall Asset Sustainability Index. Okay, take it away, Chad.
Thanks, Yana. And for folks that don't know it, and for the VTrans folks on the screen, we know Nelson's probably working out of his Northfield, Vermont home right now, and he's struggling with the same rural broadband service that we all struggle with from time to time here in Vermont, especially with the tropical storm just passing by. So TPM's got a lot of great information on their website, and a lot of the information that Nelson was sharing is on that site. So it's a good site to go to, especially when you're looking for more information on the target setting and federal performance measures there. So yeah, so good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you are. I wanted to start off my part of the presentation here, just showing folks what we do have for targets for VTrans. And what you notice, I'm showing you the pavement side first, and I tried to show what we had for baseline measurements, which we reported actually in 2018. What we only had to report a portion of these as the baseline target, but we've gone back in here and filled out the rest of them for the interstate that was in good and poor condition. I don't believe that was necessarily needed to be reported in 2018. But what you can see here is that we do have our mid-performance period targets or measures ready to go, and we'll be filing those pretty soon. We're highlighting one of our measures in yellow there, which is the amount of the non-interstate in poor condition. We set a target of 9.9% for that, which is about as close to the maximum as you can get, and we have 9.3%, and I'll get into that a little bit more later why that is, because it's probably one of the more significant discussion points that I want to bring forward today. Overall, our interstate's in decent condition, and you know, we have a very low volume of poor condition in the state. Moving on to our bridges. Moving on to our bridges, the targets that we've set here are a little bit more aggressive than the 10% target in poor condition, but we've had a number of years now where we've been able to contain or maintain a poor condition that's under 5%. So we wanted to definitely pass the straight face test here, and we believe we're going to be able to sustain that poor condition metric for a number of years to come. So some of the things we want to talk a little bit about today, data being one of them. And I know from looking at some of the HPMS reports out there that, you know, maybe we're not all looking at some of the same metrics, and maybe that's some of the initial reasons why we didn't have that baseline measurement to set for the interstates, as we were all trying to understand what kind of, you know, criteria we need to be looking at for the pavement condition. In V-Trans, we've been looking at IRI, rutting and cracking for a number of years now. And what I alluded to in the pavement performance measures where we had that non-interstate in poor condition, the NHS non-interstate in poor condition, that's 9.3. One of the areas of focus for us has been to understand, well, what is on the NHS? And back in 2012, if something was a principal arterial, that just was added to the NHS. And so we had spent our early part of preparation for the performance measures and discussions with our MPO as to, well, what should be on the NHS and what shouldn't be. So I'm giving you a little preview into some of the other slides here, but it relates to the fact that we started collecting pavement data on some of those principal arterials that were brought into the NHS as early as we possibly could, so that we would have some data, you know, not a whole lot of data points, but some data to make some early judgments on as to what the target should be for those measures. So in Vermont, we're a small state. It's about 600,000 people, and we do have one MPO. And the MPO here is shown in red, and that is all of Chittenden County. And that is where a lot of our residents live. It contains Burlington, Vermont, our largest city. And the MPO there is the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, and we have a great relationship with them. We work hand in hand on many number of items. So it's easy for Vermont in the sense that we don't have an MPO crossing boundaries, and it's only one that we're working and collaborating with. I just wanted to show some statistics about that MPO here on the screen, so you can kind of get an idea of the size and the number of folks employed in that region. And so I mentioned earlier how MAP 21 had added a lot of mileage to the NHS. And so we were working with our local division office as well as the MPO to understand what a reasonable NHS is, because this had some impacts or effects as to what the investment levels might be in the future. Is related back to, well, how much of the inventory are you trying to manage that's, you know, NHS non-interstate? That was one of our primary concerns here. Of course, V-Trans was really, because we're small and we're centralized state, we're rural. We've been managing the interstate through the MPO for a number of years, and the MPO was totally comfortable with us determining when the right time it was to make a a treatment on the interstate. But there was an opportunity they saw that they could funnel a little bit more money to their region by having a little bit more NHS mileage on the non-interstate routes. And so there was a little bit of a push and pull or some discussions as far as to, well, what does that look like? And what does the national highway system, how do we move people and freight efficiently through the corridors? And so we did have a series of discussions, a series of trade-offs, and in a sense we added 8.6 miles of new NHS, but we also were able to remove about 35 miles of highway that was non-contiguous, had some dead ends, was only added to the national highway system because it was identified as a principal arterial, but it really didn't link to the national highway system. And I can show you what that looks like. So here what you see on the left is we see the principal arterials that were added by MAP 21 and around that 2012 timeframe. We see some of those roads that are more green, that kind of have some dead ends, or maybe offer a redundant way to get from point A to point B, a pathway that is served by the interstate now. But we did want to add some additional highways to make sure that we had connections to the international airport. Yeah, that Burlington actually has an international airport. It's kind of hard to get in and out, but you can get there from here. And we do have some NHS to rail stations and to the rail yards and things like that. But the option C there, what you see on the right, is what we ended up as. And you can see that's a little bit cleaner and a little bit leaner. And it, you know, from a lot of us, it passes that kind of straight face test. So mentioned the collaboration coordination we have with the MPO. And what that really involved was a couple of meetings. We presented our data to the MPO. We said, here are the targets. This is what we think we can reasonably achieve through the given investment levels that we're projecting moving forward. And asked them for their input, for their comments. We've made them very aware of the fact that they had 180 days to come up with their own targets if they wish, but they could certainly use our performance measures. And we talked about who's going to be responsible for data collection, and it didn't make sense for the MPO to do any of that data collection on their own, and that's where VTrans was stepping in there and taking care of that pavement data collection for the MPO. And so the MPO came back and said, yep, we accept your performance measures, and asked if there was any way that they could support that, and we moved forward from that point on. And I guess the last topic I want to talk a little bit about today would be the alignment of our performance projections with our agency plan and goals. And specifically, I'll be talking about the long-range transportation plan, the strategic plan, and the asset management plan. We recently developed our long-range transportation plan. And in that long-range transportation plan, we included our performance targets for our federal measures. One of the discussions I know we have when we have the peer exchanges, and Steve Gay is always saying, who's using the federal performance measures to manage, your investments, to manage your network. And I know it seems like consistently that most of us state DOTs, we have had our performance measures, different performance measures around for a long time, and we've been able to, or are used to, managing our network based on our statewide performance measures. And that's something that in VTrans, I think is coming a little bit more into focus for us, the fact that we're going to need to align future projections, the financial plan within the TAMP, to be more cognizant, I think, of the federal performance targets. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit when we talk about the TAMP and the consistency determination process. One of the things that was a little bit of a surprise for me was that our strategic plan was recently updated last spring. And before that, our strategic plan was I felt had a really strong connection to asset condition, and it identified our performance metrics, our state performance metrics, and it mentioned map 21. But the most recent plan here just talked about providing, a transportation system that was in a state of good repair, and it had removed those specific references to pavement and bridge conditions. So for me, this represents quite a bit of a risk anyways, because we've always used our strategic plan to provide that overview for where we need to implement our tactical operations that spin out of our transportation asset management plan. So in our TAMP, we just chose to go with pavements and bridges, although we're looking at other assets now, but we communicated our federal measures and our state measures, and we're clear as to how we have typically in the past moved forward with managing the network. And I showed you our performance measures early in this presentation, so you got a good idea that we're able to maintain our network at the current investment level. That doesn't mean that our asset sustainability index is necessarily in a great shape. Right now, it's probably 0.67, so we have 67% of the money we need to maintain all of our transportation assets in a state of good repair. It just means that we're prioritizing a lot of the investments on the interstate, on those higher traveled routes, higher ABT routes. But one of the risks that we have, and it's identified in our recent efforts working with our local division office, who we have a great relationship with, is in our TAMP financial plan, we identified a couple figures from our Dayton DTIMS output that looked at how much we would be investing on our network. And we just use that raw output because that's how we kind of utilize that in our process to look forward. But we use kind of more of a 5-year average outlook. We kind of look backwards 5 years and look ahead 5 years, and we kind of, when you look at a bar graph that shows a bunch of different investment levels, maybe it goes up to 60 and then down to 30 and over to 50 and back down to 25, and kind of even that out a little bit, because as we're trying to put a capital program together, we're certainly not going to pass that much variation onto our contracting community. We want to keep them employed and so they can understand what kind of work's coming at them. So we realized that we need a better alignment of our work types, and we need to be a little bit more thoughtful when we put our 10-year paving plan together that's based on our DTIMS output, that we are cognizant of the work type and looking at those forward projections to understand how the paving plan, the 10-year paving plan, or the 10-year bridge plan that we're putting together, what's the performance look like on the NHS interstate, on the NHS non-interstate, and of course we also have to be aware of what our statewide measures are also looking like within that. So one of our mitigation measures to this risk is to add some checkpoints into our selection and project delivery processes to ensure that we have that alignment moving forward. Again, these are two mitigations that we're just moving forward with. They're just in the early stages, but taking that output that you're getting from your asset management system, our asset management system identifies specific locations that need to be worked on. It doesn't necessarily identify projects. That's still left up to the engineers and technicians and specialists. And so we need to de-optimize that and align that with our 10-year paving and bridge plans and corridor management plans. So that's the end of my presentation. I guess I'm going to turn that back over to Hyuna to move on to the next presentation.
Thanks, Chad. That was very interesting. I do want to comment that we're going to re-record Nelson's introduction and add it to the video of this webinar. So if you want to hear a better sound quality version, just go back and check it out. I think we'll try to get it done in the next day or two. Our next presentation, I'd like to introduce two speakers, Tanveer Chowdhury and Adam Mateo. Tanveer works as the Assistant Division Administrator for Virginia DOT's Maintenance Division. In his current role, he's responsible for the Pavement Management System, the Highway Maintenance Management System, and the Roadway Inventory Management System. He oversees the pavement data collection, analysis, pavement maintenance budgeting and allocation, pavement performance target setting and monitoring for the 128,000 lane miles of state-maintained roads in Virginia. Joining Tanvir is Adam Mateo, also from VDOT. Adam is the Assistant State Structure and Bridge Engineer for the Bridge Maintenance and Bridge Management Unit. In this role, he's responsible for establishing policy for the maintenance of over 19,000 of Virginia's highway bridges and large culverts. He has 35 years of engineering experience in structural design, bridge maintenance, and construction management. Now I'll turn it over to Tanvir and Adam.
Okay, thank you, Hiana, and good morning, good afternoon. I am going to go over the pavement target setting portion of the Transportation Asset Management Plan. And as most of you that are familiar with the target setting process, you probably know that the target setting involves a lot of individuals within a state agency. And so I'm not going to get into the details of all of that. I will only talk about one specific aspect of VDOT's target setting process for pavements. And I do not think that this was a unique challenge for VDOT. This was something that I believe many other state agencies had to deal with when the MAP 21 target setting, when we all had to do the target settings for MAP 21. So VDOT has a long history of performance measures, management, and monitoring for its core assets like pavements and bridges. Our first public dashboard was established in 2004. So we have been showing our pavement and bridge condition data along with many other agency information publicly since 2004. We also have state legislative requirements for establishing performance targets, monitoring those targets, reporting based on those targets, and more importantly, budgeting our maintenance dollars based off of needs and targets. So we have been doing a lot of these activities over the last 10 to 12 years. As a result, VDOT has robust and matured pavement and bridge management systems that we have worked on over the last decade. Unlike Vermont and many other state agencies, we are very decentralized. We maintain most of our secondary pavements and our local roads. We maintain an inventory of 129,000 lane miles, of which 5,600 lane miles are interstates, about 22,000 primaries, and over 100,000 lane miles of secondary roads. We also have about 600 lane miles of frontage roads that we maintain. The federal focus, the MAP 21 focus for target setting was obviously just the NHS portion, which is only about 19,000 lane miles of 129,000 lane miles of inventory that we have to maintain. Of the 19,000 lane miles that are part of our NHS inventory, all interstates are part of that. About half of our primaries are part of the NHS and a very few secondary roads. So you can easily see from this picture that a vast majority of our state-maintained inventory are outside of the NHS, for which we will need to continue to set targets, monitor performance, and report and budget based off of our state legislative requirements, which are outside of MAP 21. And of the NHS inventory, of the 19,000 lane miles of NHS inventory, about 16,000 lane miles are maintained by VDOT or state maintained. The remaining 3,000 lane miles are maintained by the localities. VDOT, by the way, within Virginia, we have 13 MPOs. So the unique challenge for us when it came to setting up performance targets for the MAP 21 measures was not really to see how we can set up the targets based on the MAP 21 measures. Rather, the challenge was how we continue to do our business and maintain and report on the state legislative requirements and continue measuring our state and continue measure and report our state measures, and how we essentially add the federal requirements and the federal measures and not change our state practices. So the way the current process works is that we start with our data collection process and we go through an automated distress data collection. And we have detailed distress types that we collect on asphalt, jointed concrete, and continuously reinforced concrete pavements. After the data has gone through the QA/QC process, the data goes into the VDOT's pavement management system, and we summarize the data based on our load-related distress rating, non-load-related distress rating, and our critical condition index ratings, which are then classified into excellent, good, fair, poor, and very poor pavements. We then determine our state measures, which are based on percent sufficiency and deficiency. And the targets are then set up on our interstate primaries and secondaries separately. And some of our primary and secondary targets are based on AADT, as we have different targets based on AADT. For the federal side, we essentially use the same set of data. They're summarized differently because the federal criteria for good, fair, poor are different based on IRI, cracking, rutting, and faulting. And then once the good, fair, poor are determined based on the federal criteria, then we essentially set up targets, or we did set up targets for percent good, percent poor for interstates and non-interstate NHS. The part of the exercise that I would like to talk about today a little bit here is how we went about the federal target setting process. As I mentioned, that the challenge for us was not to figure out how we were going to set the federal targets, but how we can essentially carry on with our existing pavement management system, maintain our iteration models, and then the federal targets that we set up based off of the federal criteria, those are consistent with the state targets and the state legislative mandates that we have to meet. So for that, we try to develop a correlation between the VDOT performance condition indices and the federal measures. We used historical data from 2013 through 2016 for these 4 years, and we developed models based on our condition indices, and we applied those models to see how that works on the most recent data which we had at that point, which was 2017 pavement condition data. What this allowed us to do essentially was that we were able to continue to do performance forecasting and investment optimization based on the models that we already had in our pavement management system. And we established correlations that would allow us to do the federal target setting and the performance goals. As you know, as all of you know, that we had to set up the targets and the goals for 2 years, 4 years, and 10 years. So essentially, this allowed us to go through that process, keep our existing performance models, and use the correlation that we had developed in this process to set up the corresponding federal targets, which were consistent with the state targets using the state condition indices. So this slide, don't pay attention to a lot of the information here in this slide. I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that the actual exercise itself was pretty heavy on statistics. We used some consultant help to do this work, and we used the PMS optimization analysis output, used our predicted critical condition index and IRI to come up with the federal performance percent good and percent poor for the interstates and the non-interstate NHS. The process itself was pretty detailed and elaborate, and we have very good documentation of the process. And I'd be happy to share this document with anyone who's interested to see the exercise that we went through to develop this correlation. Again, the objective of my talk today was just to focus on this one aspect of the federal performance setting that we went through 2 years ago. And the main focus for us was to not lose what we had worked on and developed over the last 10-15 years through our own internal pavement management system, but to just add on to the federal criteria and report on the federal criteria and not lose the state performance measures and the targets that we had developed over the years. So that takes me to the end of my slides, and I'd be happy to answer any questions later on or share any other documentation that anybody is interested. And I'm going to hand it over to Adam now.
Okay, good afternoon. It's afternoon for me anyway. Yeah, I'm Adam Mateo, and I work with Tanvir at the Virginia Department of Transportation. I'll be talking about a little different aspect of our performance management system, and that's really our state targets. We, like every state, we're obliged to follow the federal targets, and we did establish them, but they are not our primary focus. And that's for a few reasons, kind of like what Tanvir was talking about. Virginia's a little different. In the 1930s, during the Depression, the state took over the vast majority of the bridges and roadways. So the NHS is only a part of what we have to deal with as an agency. And I'll also say we've been doing performance management for a long time. And we had, our own kind of particular views about how it should be done. And so when the federal measures came in, we took a long look at it and we said, do we need to do this now instead of what we had been doing before? And we decided against it. We said, well, we're in a different place, and obviously we have to report our federal performance data. We establish targets, but we have a state, kind of a parallel state performance management system as well, and that's what I'll really be talking about mostly. The one additional thing I'll say about our federal bridge targets is that we had a lot of we thought we had good data, but we had a lot of data catching up to do over the past few years, because we made some assumptions about border and federally owned bridges, that they would be pretty much the same as Virginia bridges. But we found out, sadly, that was not the case. So we had to make a kind of a backward adjustment of our data from the baseline once we learned that what was really happening with the federally owned bridges in our state. There's a lot of them. We have a lot of federal properties in Virginia, and we border a lot of states as well. Some of those are really big bridges. But now on to Virginia's system then for performance management. I apologize for the density of the slide, but as I said, we've been doing performance management for a long time. And the big takeaway is that our primary focus has been on the percentage of bridges in our system by count that are structurally deficient. Back in 2009, we established a statewide target of no more than 8%. And then in 2012, we said, hey, let's look at that breakdown by highway system. We said, well, 3% for interstates, 8% for primaries, and a few more for secondaries, 11%. And then we kind of got to looking at it a little more. In 2014, we added some more, still keeping these structurally deficient goals, but we said we really need to get more involved with system preservation. And so we added some measures for fair bridges and satisfactory bridges with a minimum general condition rating of 6, and also eliminating expansion joints. We wanted to do that. And then as we got better toward our goals, as we met and exceeded our goals, we tightened them up a little bit. And then in 2016, we made those SD goals, structurally deficient percentage goals, even tighter by highway system and statewide. And we've been successful. I think we've emphasized this. This has been our primary focus. And in the last 10 years, we've taken 2,130 bridges out of structural deficient status. We're proud of that. And a lot of those are small bridges, but they're very important to the people in the rural communities that use them. If you have to deal with a posted bridge in a rural route, you know that's important to you. And here's another chart of what we've done. So this goes back to 2010, and these two curves show the percentage of structurally deficient bridges by count and by deck area in 2010, and we've been driving that number down. So you just kind of see the general trend, and we're about to, I think, probably a good place with that. And so we'll just kind of focus on the previous slide, which showed, hey, we took 2,130 bridges out of structural deficiency, but the drop over that time was 927. And so what that meant was that we were another 1,200 were falling into structural deficiency. So you kind of have this churn, and we really kind of have gotten to this point where there's two ways to keep a bridge, to reduce your number of structurally deficient bridges. One is to repair them after they get structure deficient. Two is to keep them from becoming structure deficient in the first place. And that was really why we said, well, why don't we focus on our targets here instead so much rather than so much on the federal targets. And so last year we did a statewide review, kind of a big process review. It was called the Comprehensive Investment Strategy Review, and that was a big fancy thing. And we did, it was a year-long study, and Tanvir and I worked together really hard on that, he on the pavement and I on the bridges. And we did a lot of modeling, and for the bridge portion, we did a 50-year model. Now, these slides show a different set of numbers. These are the percentage of bridges that are not structurally deficient. It's kind of the inverse of the previous slide. So you can see the percentage that aren't structurally deficient statewide is getting better and better. And the same for interstates, and I could show the same curves for these blue curves for all highway systems. But hidden behind that is a slow degradation of the average general condition rating. And that's our biggest concern. So when you look ahead 50 years from now, you say, where are we going to be? Are we going to have a network of bridges that's capable for the job? We're replacing a couple hundred bridges a year, 150, and most of them are small. And at that rate, with our inventory, we're not going to replace them all for 160 years. So we had to take a different approach. And this investment strategy review said, well, if we have to sustain this inventory for 50 years, how do we do it? What's the right way? What's the right balance? And what's an acceptable level of service for our bridge inventory? That was something that was kind of almost a philosophical question as well. So out of that strategy review, we did this long-term modeling, and we said, well, how much money do we need? How do we measure success? And what do we need to do? So what's this acceptable level of service? And not only how much do we need for the entire inventory, but how much by system, and what's the right balance of spending between replacement, preservation, rehabilitation, that sort of thing. And we've always had a strong, I think, preservation system, but really not strong enough. Just for reference, we've been putting about 75% of our money into the end of life, structure deficient bridges, and about 25% into other interventions for bridges. And really what we found is we probably needed to flip that. We needed to put about 25% into preservation of all forms. That would include even deck and superstructure replacements, but also culvert lining, overlays, coatings. We're a big fan of joint eliminations. Every state has a different set of problems that bother them. For us in the Mid-Atlantic region, it's really corrosion and scour. Those are we get a lot of rain, a lot of snow, a lot of salt. So corrosion is the thing that really bothers our bridges the most. And so what this graph shows is our 50-year analysis for curves for investment strategies. So what we did is we said, okay, let's look at two things. What would our average weighted general condition rating be? Now that's weighted by something called the importance factor, so that not every bridge is the same. An interstate bridge gets a little more weight than a secondary bridge because it's more important to the system. But suffice it to say, this is about like the average general condition rating. So we said over 50 years, if we do a preservation approach, that's a green line, then we can kind of have a nice slow glide toward 5.5, 5.6 over the time. That's average general condition rating for all components over time. But we said we have to get on it right away, and it has to be a kind of what we would call a stable 5.6. That means that it's not just a 5.6, but everything is preserved, and it's not, the mechanisms of deterioration have been addressed. And for us, again, that's joints, decks, scour, that sort of thing. And then, but if we did this kind of continued on the path that we're on, this worst first approach, we would reach a level of unsustainability within the next 10 to 15 years. We just can't replace our way out of it. So that's that lower set of curves. But we also track the percentage of bridges that are not structure deficient. And we found, similarly, people had a tough time accepting this, but if we keep bridges from becoming structure deficient, we found that the preservation approach actually gives us a better SD curve. It is kind of counterintuitive for many people to accept that. And this is with level funding. So we actually, our Commonwealth Transportation Board that runs our transportation was pleased with that we didn't have to ask for more money. So we are now changing our performance measures and targets. Where, as I mentioned, we're targeting 25% for replacement. That will always be part of our program, the 75% for preservation. And we found that our primary system had actually been the most neglected over the secondary and interstates. The interstates get some large P3 projects, and the secondaries, we have a phenomenal set of bridge crews that do that sort of work. And we found that if we decided that if we can keep our average general condition rating at 5.6, but a preserved 5.6, it will be okay. And we still have structure deficient percentage limits, 3% for interstate, 7% for primary, and 10% for secondary. And that concludes my slides. And like Tanvir, I'd be glad to answer any questions if anybody has them at the end.
Thanks, Tanvir and Adam. And if you have a question for them, please add them to the questions bar in your menu. Our next speaker is Tim Lemon from Michigan DOT. Tim serves as a transportation planner at Michigan DOT. He's helped MDOT craft their final transportation asset management plan, create on-demand forecasts of statewide pavement condition, and implemented the federal performance measures being discussed here today. Take it away, Tim.
Thank you, Yana, for that introduction. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, perfect, thank you. So as mentioned, I'm Tim Lemon, a planner for Michigan Department of Transportation and coordinator of the Michigan TPM pavement team. I specialize in a network-wide focus on pavement condition with duties including forecasting, metric implementation, and investment analysis. I work within the department to combine our condition data and pavement engineering strategies to create a comprehensive narrative of our efforts that can be shared externally. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about our experiences in setting targets for the federal pavement measures in conjunction with our MPO partners. I'd like to start with a little background on Michigan as a state. Michigan is unique in that a significant majority of the population lives in the southern portion of the Lower Peninsula, near Ohio and Indiana. All 14 of our metropolitan planning organizations are located in this region, and of the 10 million citizens of Michigan, half live in Detroit's SEMCOG MPO alone. At MDOT, we rely on our MPO partners for the facilitation of their regional transportation improvement programs. This table can be found in our Transportation Asset Management Plan and demonstrates how NHS ownership is distributed. As you can see, in terms of lane miles, local agencies own and maintain approximately 1/4 of the non-interstate NHS system. When MDOT implements NHS asset management strategies like those required by the TPM rulemakings, it's paramount that we coordinate with our MPO partners to empower them to act with true performance-based planning principles in mind. At the time the original PM2 NPRM was released, MDOT utilized two different performance measures for pavement condition: remaining service life and PASER. Remaining service life, or RSL, is a measurement of the expected time before a particular section of pavement requires rehabilitation or reconstruction based on cracking data and other contextual information. RSL is collected and calculated on MDOT trunk line exclusively. PASER, or Pavement Surface Evaluation and Rating, is a visual evaluation of pavements conducted in a joint collection effort between the Michigan Transportation Asset Management Council, our MPO partners, and MDOT. Unlike RSL, PASER is collected on the entire paved federal aid system. Together, these measures represent the extent of the NHS in Michigan and are used in tandem when evaluating its condition. Performance-based planning at MDOT has been predicated upon the use of these measures for more than 15 years. Compare Michigan's existing measures to the federal performance measure, what we refer to as the Pavement Condition Measure, or PCM. Unlike RSL or PASER, PCM is an index of metrics from sensor data, specifically IRI, cracking, rutting, and faulting. This measure is, of course, utilized on the NHS system, which, as I mentioned, is partially state trunk line, partially locally owned. When we first began the analysis of the federal measures used to monitor and report pavement condition, we took a moment to compare how the definition of each measure changed the statewide perception of pavement condition in Michigan and found the difference to be drastic. The percentage of poor pavements were significantly lower than those reported by either RSL or PASER, and the percentage of good pavements were higher. This new measure really represented a challenge for MDOT in that we were unfamiliar with its use and even yet have yet to develop a comprehensive forecasting tool. As a result, for our 2019 Transportation Asset Management Plan, MDOT continued to include both RSL and PASER as means of conducting performance gap analysis. We discussed the differences between these measures at greater length in our TAMP, which is available online at michigan.gov/MDOT. In response to the creation of the NPRM, MDOT established the Michigan TPM Pavement Team, which includes representatives from the Grand Valley Metro Council, as well as Southeastern Michigan Council of Governments, our two largest MPOs. The overarching goal of this team is to see that the federal requirements surrounding this measure are implemented and that our MPO partners are empowered with the information they need to utilize it. This information sharing effort has two pieces, the first being an open and transparent process for target setting, as well as a direct data sharing effort that I'll describe in a moment. That team established a target setting methodology based on the information that was readily available to them at the time. The four pillars of this methodology include short-term trend analysis of the measure, rating group buildup or bucket analysis, utilization of our existing performance measures, and finally, an assessment of risks to the NHS pavement condition. We only utilized short-term trend analysis because we did not feel that our historical pavement data adequately fit the definition of the federal measure as stated in the rulemaking. As a result, the team made the decision to throw out any data older than 2013 for the purposes of target setting. What we were able to establish from the small amount of historical data we did have was that the general trend of the PCM measure was a very slow process of improved performance, at least for the interstate. This was in contrast to the trend of our established performance measures, which showed consistent annual condition decline. The new federal performance measure had a profound impact on the way we at MDOT do performance-based planning. The details of the target setting analysis reflect our efforts to be proactive in establishing new methodologies. Here I've listed the most substantial findings of that target setting methodology outlined a few slides ago. Not only did our established measures show consistent decline, but that decline was also evident in forecasts of RSL and PASER statewide. The grouping or bucket analysis indicated that the distribution of pavements with good IRI on the NHS were strongly skewed towards the poorer end of good. This suggested to the team that there existed the possibility of a movement en masse from good to fair, something that simple trend analysis couldn't account for. We also had concerns about changes in data collection and calculation and how they could impact the distribution of good, fair, and poor assets. Hammering out the fine details of data collection for these elements with our vendor is an ongoing effort. It definitely impacted our mid-performance period report. On top of that, we evaluated risks to the NHS pavement condition, the chief among them being the inherent risk of one of our funding sources, the state income tax redirection from the general fund. Those risks accounted for, the team used short-term trend analysis to establish conservative targets that reflected the level of uncertainty in the use of the measure itself, as well as the uncertainty surrounding the future of pavement investment in Michigan. On the interstate, the 4-year percent good target was set 9 points below the 2017 condition, while the percent poor target was set 5 points above that condition state. Similarly, on the non-interstate NHS, conservative targets were established in a series of 3 points of deterioration from the baseline. Our MPOs unilaterally adopted these targets. The TPM pavement team established a number of methods to coordinate on these targets with our MPOs. The first step was to create a TPM pavement newsletter that communicated the often confusing details of the federal regulations in one convenient document, as well as illustrated MDOT's efforts in gathering data, reporting that data, and implementing performance-based planning practices. The team also meets with the Michigan Transportation Planning Association to communicate with the MPOs in a direct format. Direct communication allows us to inform the MPOs of their reporting requirements, and more importantly, it allows us to educate them on the details of the practical use of the measure. Finally, we supplied the MPOs with report cards that indicated their localized pavement condition so that they were empowered to make educated target setting decisions of their own. We update all of this information at least biannually, if not more often. So here's an example of one of our latest updates to those MPO report cards. They indicate condition levels as well as total mileage within the MPO boundary. We found these to be very popular as they provide each MPO with a direct summary of their data compared to statewide pavement condition levels. We also provide the MPOs a more granular look at their data through a publicly accessible online ArcMap portal, also available on our website under GIS and Open Data. I want to conclude the presentation by saying that for MDOT, MPO coordination is more than just a requirement to be found within public rulemaking. It's a practical necessity that ensures the proper maintenance and stewardship of the entire NHS. And I want to thank you all for your time and thank our friends at FHWA and the FHWA for supporting this event. My contact info is listed here, so feel free to email me with additional questions.
Thanks, Tim. And wrapping up our agency presentations today, we'll hear from Mike Johnson from Caltrans. Mike is the State Asset Management Engineer for Caltrans. In his asset management role, he's responsible for implementation of state and federal asset management requirements and statewide coordination of the shop development. Now let's hear from Caltrans. And Mike.
Good afternoon, Hyana. Thank you. Happy to be here, everybody. I'm waiting for PowerPoint to queue up. I'm still seeing Tim's screen.
Yes.
Mike, do you see the request to take over as
Yeah, here it is.
Okay, great. Oh, the power of technology. Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about how Caltrans went about setting targets for the state of California. And I wanted to start off by just acknowledging that this is really kind of a two-step process, or two really big steps. The first one was that Caltrans had to set targets for the assets that we manage. And then we also had to set NHS targets for the state of California. And the difference between the two is that in California, we have a lot of assets that are on the NHS that are not being managed by Caltrans. And so this really made the coordination with our MPOs and also our regional transportation planning agencies. And I'll talk about why both in the course of the presentation here. But just for a little bit of background, California has 18 different MPOs, and we have 26 regional transportation planning agencies. And so when we started in our target setting approach, we although the regulations only really recognize the MPOs, we actually included both the MPOs and the regional transportation planning agencies, which meant we were coordinating with 44 different entities in the state of California. Now, for the first part, the target setting that Caltrans did for the assets that we managed, we utilized custom development tools that allowed us to put together performance cost curves that allowed us to evaluate various starting conditions and ending conditions relative to cost. And that was our basic approach. For pavement, we subdivided our pavement into 3 different classes of pavement. The first class was all the interstates, and then we subdivided the non-interstate state-managed pavement into 2 further classes. For bridge, we had a single class for all bridges. In other words, we didn't choose to have different targets for bridges, but we did for pavement. In other words, our interstates have a more aggressive performance target than our non-interstate owned pavements. But for today's presentation, I really want to focus not on how we got the Caltrans target, but how we worked with our MPOs and our regional transportation planning agencies to develop the state of California's target. And so, why this is important, is shown in part here. These 2 maps showing kind of a highlighted or detailed area of the Bay Area around San Francisco, Oakland, and then the Los Angeles area. The red is state-owned NHS, and the blue is locally owned NHS. And if you look down in the Los Angeles area, you see a whole lot of blue, and you see some pockets of blue in the Bay Area. Because of this, and because the NHS ownership was shared between Caltrans and our MPOs, it was really important that we coordinate with them. So graphically, it's kind of the tale of 2 different assets. On the pavement side, the state owns and manages 65% of the NHS, and the locals own and manage the other 35%. So in this case, it was really critical from the pavement perspective, particularly to make sure that whatever target we set for the combination of these 2 things was reflective of both what Caltrans thought we could do for our 65%, and then what our MPOs and our TPAs thought they could do for the 35%. For the bridge asset, it's really different because it's deck area based. The majority of the deck area is owned and maintained by the state. It's about a 90-10 split. So the influence that Caltrans had over the state of California's target had to be pretty substantial because we had the biggest skin in the game. So when we thought about doing this, we came up with some options, and we took these 3 options in a workshop. We had a big face-to-face workshop, invited all of our MPOs and regional transportation planning agencies together. And we said, okay, there's a couple different ways we could do this. We could look at just a fixed target across all agencies. We could try to determine an acceptable percentage improvement and apply that equally to all agencies. Or we could solicit each MPO RTPA target and then use that to develop a statewide target. So I want to walk through each of these kind of conceptually so you could see how they can lead to a very different answer. So the first approach, and by far the simplest, was to just adopt a single target and say, okay, we want to, get all pavement to be less than 2% poor, for example. And this approach, it didn't really make much sense in California. And the reason is that when we started looking at all of the MPOs and when looking at their inventory and their starting conditions, they were all really different. Some of the MPOs had done a really good job of maintaining pavement and others hadn't, and we had everything in between. In addition, each agency had very different funding availability. Part of the reason for that is that half of the counties in California have a local transportation sales tax. And so how much money each agency had wasn't really clear to Caltrans. We generally see the federal money, but we don't see all the local generated money that these agencies had. And so setting a single, goal of 2% poor, for example, didn't make much sense because some of the agencies may have been at, 10, 15% poor, and others might have been at 1% poor already. So it didn't seem like this approach made a whole lot of sense. And when we brought all of the MPOs and RTPAs together, they didn't really like this approach too much, but it is one that we considered. A second approach we considered, and this is kind of a conceptual math, if you will, but in this example, we're bringing into play the percent of the inventory that each agency owns. So this is very hypothetical because I didn't want to show each MPO's results in a national meeting like this without their approval, and getting their approval would have been a challenge. So anyway, conceptually, this is looking kind of like at our bridge model where the state owns 90% of the inventory. We had an existing poor condition of 3.5% at the time the targets were set. And if we looked at, just a fixed reduction of say 1%, so we want the state to get 1% better to go, so in other words, go from 3.5% poor, say to 2.5% poor. And then for the MPOs, we would take their existing starting poor, say for this, fictitious MPO number one, a 7.4%, and say, okay, we want you to get to 6.4. And then we would develop a statewide target shown at the very bottom here based on the inventory weighted targets. So the 2.5% that the state has carries 90% of the weight, and then these other targets would carry a weight proportionate to their percent of the inventory. So you get this, resulting statewide number. This approach was better received than the first approach. However, it still had the challenge that it didn't, while it brought in inventory and condition, it didn't really bring into play the financial resources that each of the agencies had to make a difference in these targets. So that kind of brings us to our third approach, which was what we call a weighted agency target. In this case, we allowed each agency to establish their own target based on their conditions, which we in Caltrans provided to them. So we did the pavement condition assessment in accordance with the federal requirements, And we were already doing the bridge inspections for almost all local agencies in California anyway. So we provided them that information. We said, okay, here is where you're starting from. And then we asked them to set a target. And similar to the prior approach, we used the targets that they established, weighted by the inventory that they had, to come up with a statewide target. This model was pretty well received. It provided the flexibility that each agency was looking for to set their targets. It was reflective of the size of their inventory, because some of these MPOs, they might have had 1 or 2 bridges or a couple lane miles of NHS pavement. And so, you know, their contribution to the overall state goal might have been pretty minor. And then on the other extreme, like we had our Southern California area of governments, which is our MPO that covers the Los Angeles and surrounding areas. They actually have about 50% of all the locally owned NHS in their jurisdiction. So that MPO was really critical, because what they decided to do could actually move the statewide needle. But additionally, it allowed each of these MPOs to understand where they were starting from, understand what fiscal resources they might have available, and understand what their competing priorities were. And so what we asked of them was, okay, we will allow you to set your own targets, but we want you to explain to us how you did it, what the methodology was. And in almost all cases, the MPOs were doing analysis similar to some of the ideas that you've seen today. They may have been using different tools, and in some cases, they were even using different metrics within those tools, but they all arrived at a target that then they would take to their respective boards or approving body, whatever that might be. And then they would then send us their results. And so we asked each executive director of every MPO to sign off on these targets when they sent them in to us. And then we took them and in an inventory weighted approach came up with the statewide target. So this inventory weighted approach allowed the agencies to set their own, and their portion is reflected in the statewide target. And this is what we reported for PM2. So in conclusion, you know, this approach worked for us because we had a lot of agencies that owned a fair amount of the NHS. Their inventory's condition and funding is unique. It gave an opportunity to set their own. And you know, like I mentioned, our Caltrans approach was really looking at performance cost curves. And even within Caltrans, I mean, we had to take our performance evaluation and target recommendations before our California Transportation Commission, which by law in California has the authority to set these targets. So this approach worked. It gave everybody, you know, kind of the opportunity to do what was right within their agencies. We rolled that all up based on weighted inventory. And, you know, this approach got the kind of buy-in that we needed during our workshops in order to be able to push this forward as our, you know, as our PM2 targets. Now, as we're approaching the midpoint performance period, this has raised some new challenges because with COVID-19, you know, a lot of our MPOs are seeing their funding reduce, as well as Caltrans, because a lot of the funding is tied to taxes on fuel sales, and fuel sales are down, at least in the short term. Additionally, some of the agencies rely on tolls. The tolls are down, whether they're bridge or express lane tolls. And so you know, we're going to go back out to them, in fact, next week, and give them, you know, their most recent conditions from HPMS and from the NBI a couple months ago, and say, okay, here's where everybody is, here's where we were trying to go, you know, in light of the changing funding situation, where do we think we're going to be in the future? And so that's led to some timing questions about, you know, well, how do we do this if Caltrans has, you know, has up to October 1 to do our midpoint performance report, and that performance report could propose new targets. But then initially, when we first set the targets, the regs gave MPOs 180 days after that to decide if they like that target or not. You know, so we're not sure if that 180 days, it's kind of ambiguous if that 180 days is after the states reset their target, which is how we're interpreting it, which means, you know, that the state would have until October 1, and then MPOs might have until April 1st to decide to adopt or not. So we're kind of working through some of those logistics, but we are, like I said, meeting with all of them next week to try to understand where they are, what they're, you know, what they see coming in the next 2 years in light of, you know, some of the impacts from the pandemic. And, you know, we keep working and trying to, you know, trying to do the right thing and be reflective of everybody's situation. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions along with the rest of the panel, I think, at this point.
Thanks, Mike. That concludes our excellent presentations for today. Thank you to all of our speakers. And thank you to all our attendees who we couldn't do this without. Now it's time to hear from all of you on the Q&A. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature of the webinar toolbar, and I'll take them in the order we receive them. So the first question was regarding the PM2 deadline for MPOs in California. I think Mike just answered that question, but I don't know if Nelson, you want to add anything to that question.
Thank you. I just want to confirm, yes, that it is, if a state DOT chooses to adjust their target for one of the measures that's allowed, and these are the 4-year targets, then hopefully that is done in collaboration with the MPOs. And then once that adjustment has been confirmed by the state DOT, then the 180 days from that date of the adjusted target, 4-year target, is how much time the MPOs have. And that's, you know, again, that's depending on that the MPOs had earlier had committed to support that state target.
Thanks, Nelson. The next question is for Chad. For the NHS miles that you removed, was this accomplished by redesignating those roadways as not principal arterials?
Yeah, Fiona, actually it was a couple different things. We did do that for some of the sections of highway that were added as principal arterials. We lowered the classification for those. And then there were some other ones that were on the NHS as a principal arterial. And we worked with Federal Highway and our MPO to make the case that, you know, we could have a Route 7 that's running parallel with I-89, and we don't need to have 2 routes running in parallel, both on the national highway system. So we would work with Federal Highway to remove, say, that state highway from the NHS. So we were really striving for as lean as we could get NHS.
Okay, the next one's for you, Chad, as well. How did you end up setting the statewide pavement and bridge targets? From the slide you showed on pavement targets, it sort of looked like a worst case set of targets.
Yeah, for sure. Let's say one of the measures was, federal highway performance measures was 10%. We set it at 9.9, or if it was 5%, we set it at 4.9. That was intended for a couple things. It was to balance the risks that we saw relative to funding. We felt like our conditions were good and we'd done well in the future, but we didn't know how much adding some of the new NHS roadways were going to impact our ability to fund and ability to develop those projects quick enough before other sections deteriorated. And we ended up outside of the 10% zone as was, I showed on one of the slides, we're at 9.3%. We set a target at 9.9, the max is 10. Even though that's one that there's not I guess a financial hit or implication on, we just felt like some of the targets we didn't want to be too aggressive on. We were aggressive on the bridge target. We set that at 6% instead of at 10 because we had the data. We had the data points to reliably say, yeah, we can keep this under 6%. So it was about balancing the risks.
Thanks, Chad. The next question is for VDOT and MDOT. Let's start with VDOT. Did you have to get approval from Federal Highways to convert your agency's performance measures to the PM2 measures?
Okay, this is Tanveer. I'm going to take the first shot at it, and then Adam, feel free to join in. So we had our local FHWA office engaged in our target setting process involved from the beginning when we were talking about correlating the state performance measures and the federal performance measures and the methodology that we were going to use to do this. We had conversation with them from the beginning, so that way they were engaged and they understood what we were trying to do. And as a result, when we proposed the technique that we were trying to use for this, they did not have any problem agreeing with it. So yes, so the short answer is we had them engaged, and they did approve this process.
All right. MDOT, Tim?
Yeah, so we did ask for and receive special dispensation to utilize our legacy performance measures within our TAMP, but there was no sort of desire to be converting back and forth between those legacy measures and the PM2 measers. More or less, the idea is to utilize in a forecasting capacity our existing measures while we develop strong support and a fully functional forecasting tool for the PM2 measures.
So Tim, an additional question: does MDOT, take on the request to convert from PACER to PM2 that's coming from SEMCOG and other MPOs? So does MDOT take the lead in helping your MPOs convert their PACER pavement condition index to match PM2?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's not really an attempt to convert them. I don't think. The idea is really more or less to support these measures and get them to be functional as standalone, tools.
All right. This is a general question, so if you want to respond, how do state DOTs account for bridges in the pavement condition data? Do state DOTs include bridges when calculating the pavement measures?
In California, we take it out.
I think by by federal regulation that is the case.
All right. Mike, this is for you. Do MPOs in California have taxing authority, and consequently, do they directly manage the non-state highways under their jurisdiction?
That's a good question. Funding is complex in California. You know, I saw a couple questions in here that get at who, you know, who actually owns versus who manages the money. The short answer is there are tolling authorities within certain MPOs, yes. These include bridge tolls and highway express lane tolls. So there is that source of funding. But it is interesting that MPOs don't own assets. Cities and counties own assets. The MPOs represent those cities and counties in a broader, more regional context. And so this has and continues to be a challenge for us in Caltrans, because if you talk to the MPOs and you say, well, how much, you know, what kind of financial resources do you have available? They can't answer, because the money in many cases is going directly to a county, for example, with a county sales tax measure. So it's complicated, and it changes for every MPO, and sometimes from county to county within an MPO's jurisdiction.
All right, we're past the time, but I'm going to just, if people don't mind staying with us for a few more questions, let's try to get through as many as possible. This is for Mike, you again. For Caltrans, local agencies in California have over 35% of the non-interstate NHS in PCI based on ASTM D6433. How do you get the conversion from PCI to PM2?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't. There is no way to convert the two, because they look at different distresses. And I think that, you know, the previous question touched on this, well, 2 questions ago touched on this a bit. Even in Caltrans, I mean, we use models that are more granular than the federal metrics. So I mean, I think everybody just has to recognize it's okay to be managing based on one metric and also reporting on a different metric. In fact, you know, for pavement and for bridges, you know, just in the course of this webinar, I mean, you've seen talk of structurally deficient, you've seen talk of poor. You know, there are multiple metrics out there. You know, I guess my perspective is generally, if you're making good decisions about these assets, they're going to reflect positively in all the metrics.
All right. So for all of the states who presented today, do any of your MPOs actually own or maintain any of the NHS pavements or bridges, or are they locally owned and managed by them, but they're under membership of under the umbrella of the MPO?
This is Adam. I can echo what Mike was saying. In Virginia, anyway, I think this is probably pretty common. The MPOs don't own any bridges, so it's a bit of a struggle, or maybe a little bit of tension, when the MPOs were asked to establish their own goals, because they don't really have any control over those goals, and that's particularly pronounced in a state like Virginia, where most of the bridges and pavements are owned by the state, you know, 90% or so. So that's tough, because the goals we tend to really pay attention to are the statewide goals, and we report to the MPOs, and they keep track of things, but because so much is owned by the state, it's really just aspirational for the MPOs. There are some localities, cities, counties that own their own bridges and can do their own projects here and there, but by and large, they're statewide.
Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah.
Or
I'll echo that as well. MPOs in Michigan don't actually own any assets directly, but they do participate in the planning activities in order to approve jobs and maintain those assets within their region.
And in Vermont as well.
all right. And then I'm just going to do one more question, and there are a bunch more. So what we're going to do for the remaining questions is we'll send the requests to the presenters, and we will post that along with the slides, and we'll get back to the questioners. Okay, so this one is for Mike at Caltrans. Allowing the MPOs and regional agencies to set their own targets solve the need for developing a state target, but has there been any effort to promote a more cost-effective method of using available funds among their agencies to ensure that their targets are met?
Well, that's an awesome question. I was hoping you were going to ask
I thought, Mike, you would love that question.
It's an awesome question. So, you know, I said we let them establish their own targets, but we required them to define the methodology that they use and what was the basis for the target setting. They all used, some different metric or some different approaches, but I think initially this was a little bit of a leap, thinking that, okay, what if they just, don't try to, challenge themselves at all? But we didn't find that to be the case, because they were all going before their boards and they were having to justify it within their boards. And, in some of these meetings, I would attend these meetings and I would watch and listen to what they were going through with their own boards. The other aspect to this, which is really tricky, an effort to promote a more cost-effective method using available funds, that's a challenge, because I don't know what the available funds are. And frankly, they don't either, because the local agencies, the NHS in California represents like 6% of the pavement miles that local agencies have to manage. And they're not accounting of expenditures based on NHS versus non-NHS. It's just not, and frankly, it's not, Caltrans doesn't do this either, because we don't really care if it's the NHS or if it's just the state highway system. If there's something that needs to be done, we go do it. And so, I would say even to this day, we are challenged significantly with understanding how much funds are being applied to the system. And then if you introduce the 5 categories of work types that the federal government wants, it's even more challenging. So it's kind of hard for me to sit in Sacramento and dictate what MPOs might do or methods they might use when I don't even understand what their financial resources that they have available to them are. And when we ask them, they have a hard time telling us what they are. So this is probably an area where we could improve. But right out of the gate, we opted to just trust them that they were going to be doing the right things. And I think generally they did.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, everyone. All right, so let's move on to the last slides here. As we mentioned earlier, this is the 3rd in a 5-part target setting mini-series. The next episode of this mini-series will be held in 1 week on August 12th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You'll want to take note that this webinar will begin 30 minutes later than usual and will end at 4 p.m. Eastern. There was a kind of coordination conflict with the TRB webinar. The topic next time will be target setting for system performance. This webinar will focus on state transportation agency target setting for the federal PM3 system performance and reliability measures, including policy, planning, and performance considerations related to target setting. Presentations will address reliability data gaps, modeling and forecasting for system performance targets, and moving the needle on the national system. We have several great presenters in our lineup, including Subrat Mahapatra from Maryland DOT State Highway Administration, Michael Iacano from Minnesota DOT, and Dan Blevins from Wilmington Area Planning Council in Delaware. Then we'll round out the target setting mini-series with our last episode on August 26th, covering traffic congestion and emission reductions target setting. Please continue to send us ideas for future webinars and that you'd like to see. And just one final reminder, for more information, you can always visit the AASHTO TPM portal. That's tpm-portal.com. And thank you, everybody, and see you next week at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Goodbye.